Welcome to day 3 of our hay crisis special. We're talking to 3 equestrians over 3 days to find out how they and their horses are coping with the UK's hay shortage after the driest spring recorded in 100 years. Today, in the final part of our very special series, we're talking to a livery yard owner who has struggled to source enough hay for the dozens of horses in her care. One hay harvest, shockingly, set on fire during what was the hottest summer on record in England. Lauren Johnson joins us now, the owner of Graveney Equine horse track system in Faversham in Kent, winner of Livery Yard of the Year 2024. Lauren, thank you for coming on Curious Equestrian. Before we get stuck into talking about how the hay crisis is affecting you at the moment, talk us through your setup and your herd of horses.
Okay, so I run a track system and we essentially concentrate our forage on hay. So we distribute hay around the track. The track is to try and emulate what horses would do in the wild. So we want them to make friends. We want them to have a herd. We want them to move as far as they can in a day. So, you know, some horses in wild and feral horses will move around 30 miles a day, depending on what they're looking for. And obviously we need to try and emulate the forage that they would eat as well. So unfortunately we don't have the luxury of putting them out in fields all the time. And yeah, hay is their main source. So this year particularly has been quite a challenge when it comes to hay. And obviously we're quite active on social media. So we've been talking to a lot of other people about what they can do to try and, you know, brace themselves and get through the year, essentially.
And Lauren, how many horses do you provide hay for on your livery track?
So we have 20 horses at the moment. We tend to fluctuate around the 20 or low 20s mark. But actually, to be fair, we've got space for a couple of more, but I probably won't be taking any on this year purely because of the concern with the amount of hay that we can access at the moment.
And just talk us through what you would usually do to hay your 20 horses on livery. What does that look like through the day when there isn't a hay crisis?
Okay, so we have feeders dotted around our track, basically. We have probably 10 or 12 main feeders, which involve taking a bale of hay out, putting it into the feeder and covering it up with a slow feeder net. We then have some smaller nets that we will dot around on a daily basis, just to mix it up a little bit. And we will also put some loose hay around as well, depending on the weather though, if it's all going to blow away.
Oh, it's such a struggle, isn't it? Anyway, winter, let alone
Yes.
during a hay crisis. Tell us how the shortage is affecting you, Lauren, at the moment.
So we are really lucky that on a normal year, we've got a fantastic hay supply. So we used to make our own hay when we had slightly smaller numbers of horses. And probably about 6 or 7 years ago, we realised that what we have wasn't quite going to be enough if we added extra horses to the track. So we, formed a really strong relationship with a great hay supplier, and he's been incredibly reliable. He's been really open to discussing the requirements that we have for our hay. So obviously we need a low sugar, low starch hay. And he has essentially been amazing. But there came a point this year when he realised that he just wasn't going to have enough grass to make the hay that we needed. So luckily I was also in discussion with another contractor at the time, and that was purely luck, really. I wasn't planning on switching. It was someone that I'd got in contact with through a friend who was getting hay from him, and I was actually more interested in the fact that he was testing his hay in bulk. Which is something, again, the horse track system kind of group of people is really interested in the nutritional value of hay, and someone that actually actively tests their hay before they send it out was really interesting to me. So I got chatting to this other guy anyway, which it turned out has saved my bacon, essentially. But my hay supplier thought, when he got to the point of actually cutting the grass, he contacted me and said, look, I think I might just about be able to get the hay that you need for this year. And I was like, okay, brilliant, because it's always my least favorite time of the year, trying to make sure that other things that can impact hay, like, the rain, which obviously doesn't like to stop, doesn't affect things. I then got a phone call a few hours later after we'd started cutting the hay, to say that the field was on fire. So because the weather was so hot and the grass was so dry, some sort of spark from the machinery had basically set the hayfield on fire. So a field that he would usually get around 500 large bales of hay, so bales that weigh about 200-300 kilos, he got 80 bales off this year.
Oh
so
my gosh.
I took a small amount from him, and obviously I had to pay extra per bale, which was, frustrating, but for both of us, not just for me, for him. But I was able to obviously speak to another supplier that brings hay in from all different places around the country. And because I'm lucky enough to have a big barn to store it in, I could get what I needed and get it safely into storage and, try and relax a little bit.
Because, of course, farmers that are having to buy hay in are then having to increase their cost dramatically to pay for their delivery of hay as well.
Yes.
Did you notice that ramp up in cost, Lauren?
Yeah, there's been a huge ramp up in costs. And for instance, my hay bill on a yearly basis is around £11,000-12,000, or has been for the last few years. And for slightly less hay this year, I paid an extra £3,000. Which is a lot, and it's not a buffer that I can can take on. I can't swallow that cost, and my liveries have been amazing, and they obviously understand, and I've explained it to them. But yeah, I've had to put my prices up, which nobody wants to do, because everyone's struggling, aren't they, financially at the moment.
And that's the thing with such a huge ramp up in costs, Lauren. It's like, where does that money come from? You've had to increase your costs. And for those with other types of work that might have a work contract, they're not going to see an increase in their wages to cover the hay costs. So it's an absolutely impossible situation, isn't it, for for horse owners at the moment?
It is. And historically, livery yard owners do try and swallow a lot of the costs in increases, which, they just don't have the buffer to do. There's so many livery yards that are unfortunately just about covering their costs. Livery yard owners that aren't paying themselves and haven't paid themselves for months, that they're just, the money's coming in from the liveries and it's going straight back out on, things like hay at the moment.
And you see, don't you, riding schools, liveries shutting down because they just can't cope with the increase in costs.
Yeah, they can't cope with the increase. And also, the clients, because they're being pulled financially in all directions at the moment, everybody's bills have gone up in general, household bills. The cost of food, the cost of living has really gone up, and livery clients are looking for something cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And in our area, we've seen some of the really big livery yards that have just, shut down. We can't do it anymore. And obviously, as soon as they're offered a bit of money for, land for housing, it's a no-brainer for them, isn't it? It's let's get rid of the noose around the neck, essentially.
And there's less and less land for us to keep our horses on. And you constantly see, don't you, across Facebook and across forums, people desperately looking for livery spaces or land to rent, and it just becomes more and more of a problem. But jumping back, Lauren, to the farmer saying to you, my field is on fire. I mean, what crossed your mind? Because this is essentially climate change, isn't it? With increase in temperatures and the climate that we're seeing.
Yeah, and we usually have every few years there will be inclement weather. That means, the hay supply is a little bit touch and go. We might be waiting for a break in the rain. And, sometimes we do have slightly hotter years and the yield is slightly down in general. But it was I felt like I was on a bit of a roller coaster, because we had I don't think I'm going to have enough, looking at the grass. And then we went to, I think we might just about have enough. And then to the it's on fire phone call. I panicked, essentially. I remember talking to one of my liveries a few minutes after the phone conversation and being like, I genuinely don't know what I'm going to do at the moment, because obviously I've got people I can contact, but there's absolutely no guarantee that they will take me on as a new client. And, luckily, because I'd kind of been chatting to this other contractor, I was able to secure hay. But there will be a lot of people who, they aren't able to get the hay off their usual supplier. And, as tends to happen in these sort of events, that hay suppliers will try and do their best for their current clients, but they don't have the capacity to take any more clients on. And that's the position that a lot of people are in at the moment. They're looking for a new supplier and they just cannot find anyone.
And it's absolutely terrifying. And I know you said, Lauren, it was great relief shutting those barn doors, knowing that you'd got enough hay for the rest of the year. And we all know that feeling. We just about secured hay recently for our autumn delivery that was double the cost and almost triple the delivery cost, which was hugely frightening and really difficult financially. But for those who are actually facing going from supplier to supplier, not being able to find anyone, I mean, what are their options? Do you know, Lauren?
Well, this is something that, I've been trying to think through. So we've got a fairly big Facebook community, especially, and, we're trying to help people with lots of different plans, essentially. So obviously we're telling people if they have the capacity to stock up. So if they've got a barn, or if they've got a space that they can maybe share with a friend. So maybe they couldn't afford to rent a barn on their own, but a few friends clubbing together. If you can say to a supplier, look, I've got capacity for a couple of 100 bales of hay, you're much more likely to, secure a large load of hay. And again, hopefully that's going to get you through the winter or through, the rest of the year if you're lucky. Another thing we're doing is we are, really encouraging people to look at how they're storing their hay. So a lot of people will, get a pile of hay and throw a tarpaulin over it and hope for the best. And if you lose a few bales throughout the winter, it's not so much a big deal. But this year, like, every single bale is going to count. So people need to, if they can get some kind of barn storage, brilliant. But if not, looking at some of the specialist tarpaulins that actually will still let the hay breathe and they won't trap moisture underneath them. There are quite a few of those brands available. I mean, we've got loads of suggestions. Another one is looking at either supplementing with haylage, because obviously the growing and the times of cut of hay and haylage are a bit different. So it might be that in some areas there is more haylage available. But obviously there is a potential for gut upset if people are swapping between hay and haylage. So that's something people need to think about. It's not something I could do. I've got horses that are sensitive and I couldn't swap to haylage. So that wouldn't work for me personally. But it might for some people. Another thing would be looking at mixing a certain percentage of straw in as a forage replacer and a bulk item, essentially. So horses generally can tolerate up to about a maximum of 50% of straw in their diet. It's something that needs to be done very gradually, though, certainly not just straight to lots of straw, because it obviously has the potential to cause colic, impaction colic, if you switch over to that. But it's good for good doers because there's not many calories in it. So it's something that's actually a really good option to swap to. But again, the availability of straw is not guaranteed this year either, because it's a crop and it's had the same issues as the grass has. So that's potentially, not going to be a goer for some people. Then they need to look at the hay replacements, basically. So different kind of hay nuts, hay cobs, the chaffs that you can get, just bagged chaffs from the feed store, essentially. Using those, again, just partially replacing. Obviously, the supply of those sort of products into the market are a bit more stable. So even if there is a bad year, the companies will have more of a contingency for getting those products to the market still anyway. So that might be something that people can look to bulking out their feeds with. On a wastage side of things, we're encouraging people to, use slow feeder nets. So if you're usually putting hay out loose, if you use a slow feeder net, they're going to slow down the consumption slightly, but also they're going to reduce the wastage. So you're looking at not just not using as much hay potentially, but not wasting, like clawing back the wastage. Because I mean, as a livery yard owner, I know a lot of livery yard owners will agree, especially when horses are stabled, there's the potential for a lot of wastage of hay getting, churned into bedding and trampled on and going to the toilet on it. So looking at ways to stop hay being wasted as well is really important. There's something else, again, which is depending on how you keep your horses. You can look at utilising pasture and grassland. So one of the things I personally thought about and was planning on doing if I needed to was using my middle field as standing hay. We don't tend to do that on a year-to-year basis, purely because we have some horses that are very sensitive and wouldn't cope well with it. But for me, it would have been a case of having to split the herd into two groups. So the horses that can cope with it and the horses that can't. So the ones that can would have had more access to that. And to be honest, I'm still not completely, poo-pooing that idea. Depending on how we go through the hay in the next few months, it might be something that I do in the winter for, a few of the horses that can cope. The other thing is considering different species of hay. So, generally, I mean, for me personally, I have a meadow hay, I have a mixed meadow hay. But there are other crops, such as Timothy hay, and alfalfa hay and sandfoin hay that actually fare slightly differently in the very wet and then the drought conditions that we've had. So those crops might be more successful. And again, I wouldn't advise switching completely over to a different type of hay, but if you can mix it in, that means that you're just eking out your supply, mixing in a few different things. And like I say, there might be more of a supply of certain crops that just fare better in drought conditions.
Oh, that's so interesting. And Lauren, are you using chaff, you mentioned? Are you using it as a hay replacement? And how do you do that for those who might be thinking they should?
So I probably wouldn't, purely because of the number of horses we have. It would work out expensive, basically. It's one of those things that I would only look to doing personally for a large group of horses if we really didn't have any other options, because again, it would be a lot of buying in and it would be a much increased cost to normal forage, kilo for kilo. But if people are going to do it, I would suggest looking to create slow feeders for the chaff. So for me, that would look like a big bucket or container, putting some of the chaff in, but then filling it with, trying to use your imagination, filling it with things like footballs that the horses have to kind of move around. They can't just shove their face in and eat. They've got to move the footballs around and, look for it and get to it. It's just trying to come up with imaginative ways of slowing them down, essentially.
And for those, I'm actually really interested to ask you this on a personal level as well, Lauren. So round where I'm based in the southeast of England, but towards the east, we've been told, as you mentioned, to use some haylage as well in with our hay to try and eke out the forage, because again, hay supply is really difficult around here. Yes. Very, very low, and hay suppliers only supplying their regulars, and even then we've only just about got enough, so very difficult. But you mentioned about the gut upset, and I've only just started stocking in haylage, and I've moved my cob onto part hay, part haylage every day. And then we've got the miniatures who are on purely soaked hay because they're laminitic prone. We've got a very, very low sugar haylage that they don't seem to do too well on permanently, but the odd day is okay. But I was going to ask you, can they be on, say, hay for a week and then do one day on haylage? Or you mentioned gut upset. Is that going to be a
Yeah.
bad thing to suddenly have one day haylage?
Yeah. So I guess there's a bit of nuance to that. So I definitely wouldn't go, hay for 6 days and then a haylage day. What I would do is start adding in. So if you know you're going to use, say, 7 bales of hay or 7 bales across a week, and so you've got 6 bales of hay and 1 bale of haylage, just to sort of make the numbers easier. Instead of doing the 6 days of hay and 1 day of haylage, I would spread the haylage ration out over the week instead. I would look to do that. What happens when you introduce a new feedstuff to your horse is their gut essentially has to make sure it's got the right microbes to deal with processing that food. And one of the biggest causes of colics or even laminitis is when a new feed is introduced very rapidly, the bacteria in the gut aren't familiar with the feed, and very simply, you have a mass die-off event of the gut bacteria. And when those gut bacteria die, they will release toxins. So that's when you have things like laminitis occurring, because essentially your horse's system has a huge amount of toxins pouring into it. Obviously, with things like colic, when you introduce a new feedstuff, it can impact the speed that the forage is moving through the gut. So again, that applies to if you're adding straw to the diet as well, to the rations as well. So impacting the speed things move through the gut. And just, again, with the change in bacteria, you're much more likely to get either impactions or completely the opposite and get some kind of diarrhea type episode as well. The other thing to consider when looking at haylage is that it is a slightly different pH to hay, obviously because of the fermentation process. And some horses seem to cope with that absolutely fine. Other horses just never quite, sit right with haylage, and they can even kind of move on to hindgut acidosis, which again is something that if you identify that, you would definitely need to come away from the haylage, because you're upsetting the gut microbiome too much, essentially.
It's so interesting you say this, Lauren, because not only locally but from feed suppliers is this being encouraged, but also vets are saying as well about moving on to haylage. But actually, even as experienced horse people like myself, I was not told that there was gut issues when moving them between the two. They just said you could use it to bolster the hay supply without any kind of warning. So thank you for sharing that, because it really is important that we educate ourselves into what can happen if we actually move too quickly between the two, when we're actually all in this sort of desperate scenario where we're trying to get our hay supply. What else can we use? How can we stop our hay supply going down too quickly? But actually haylage may not be the answer, even if we've got experienced vets or feed merchants telling us, oh, that's what we're all doing, and that's going to be successful for you.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons that I've been quite vocal in trying to encourage people to plan, because the person that wants to, say like yourself, wanting to use haylage, the person that plans that in to their regime a few months in advance is much less likely to have problems than a person that goes, oh, we're out of hay, I'm going to have to go and buy something from the feed shop, and then all they've got is the wrapped bales of haylage. If you're able to gradually introduce something into their diet, you're going to have a much higher chance of success of that transition than if you're putting certain feed in and then completely switching to a new forage. That's really, really dangerous and really asking for trouble.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because that's helped me not only personally, but I'm sure there are many others like me doing the same or looking for options like this and not being given those kind of warning factors as well. Lauren, when you look ahead to the winter, how are you feeling and what worries you as we all move forwards, as part of this equestrian community?
So winter for me is always a time when I just try and, I just imagine myself hunkering down and just planning on getting through it, essentially. But I think as equestrians, we are facing so many more challenges. And I don't know if I just have a very romanticized view of children when I was a child and having ponies, that it never seemed quite as hard. And I know I didn't have to pay, the brunt of the cost of things when I was very young and it was my parents looking after me. But it feels like every year we are just dealing with more and more problems. So obviously we talked about earlier the reduction in available livery yard spaces, and also, linked to that, it's not just equestrian land that's being sold for housing developments, it's farmland as well. So actually hay supply is being reduced from kind of both angles, really. We've been kind of being attacked from all different angles. I know personally I have had to deal with quite an increase in staffing costs this year, which again, I'm absolutely all for people getting a wage that they can survive on. But as a small business, again, it eats into your profits essentially. So, we've had an increase in the minimum wage, or now to the living wage. We've had an increase in national insurance costs as well. The supply of things like electricity and water haven't been too bad for us this year, increasing wise. But, this hay supply issue was a real kicker, essentially. And like I say, I just had no buffer there to absorb that amount of increase in costs.
And as you mentioned, the increase in everything, the cost of living, the cost of food in the supermarkets, and, bills in our homes, we're all, feeling that pinch on top of the hay crisis. And you bring to our attention, Lauren, about your hay man, there he is farming the field, the hay is on fire. Then we're not even bringing into the conversation as well that this could be a more common occurrence as climate change continues. And actually, you're the first I've heard, but could it be all of us next year or the year after or in 5 years' time, where our hay farmers are seeing the hay quite literally set alight in front of them?
Yeah, and climate change is a massive thing to consider in lots of different aspects of the equine world. But yeah, essentially, are we looking at every time a farmer, so we farm as well, so we kind of see the other side of the page, so to speak. Every time a farmer has a really challenging year with a certain, crop or product, you have to sit down at the end of that year and say, is this worth the stress? Are we making enough money from this? Do we have to look at doing something else? And again, do we sell the land for housing? Do we decide to plant a different crop? Do we rent it to someone else for something else? So, climate is a really difficult thing to deal with anyway when you're farming. But obviously from the other side, not just the hay supply side, looking at things like the availability of winter turnout, that is something that a lot of livery yard owners are struggling with. Now, obviously, we have a surface track system, so we're never going to be in a position where we've just got acres of mud, we can't put the horses out. But, that's a very real problem for yard owners now, is they're looking at fields that are completely churned up and poached by early winter, not even getting into the new year. And there's this really difficult balance of, do we take on more livery clients so we can get in a bit more money and then we can do X, Y, and Z? Maybe we can afford to put in a couple of turnout pens, or maybe we can afford to put in a little bit of a track system. But a lot of places are finding that because people don't want to pay as much for their livery because they've got all the other pressures on their finances, that livery yards are essentially overstocking, when actually it would be much better to have 10 people paying £600 a month, but what they've ended up with is 20 people paying £200 a month.
There's so many different aspects, isn't there? And the fact that we we're all using this year as this example, as what we're going through at the moment, the panic. Will we be able to get through the autumn, the winter? Will our hay last? But none of us yet. I think it's too scary a prospect to think about next year and the year after. The reason we're seeing this hay shortage is because of the weather and because of the drought and the dry conditions and the grass and the hay not growing. Is this going to be a usual year for us in the coming years ahead?
And it's increasingly likely, to be honest. And I think years like this year make us look outside of what we're used to slightly. And I know that some of the bigger hay suppliers and contractors are bringing in hay, which a lot of people do anyway every year, but they're bringing hay into the country in August and September, when usually it's much later in the year when you start to see shipments of hay coming over from Europe, essentially. So is that something that's going to become more normal? In which case, the cost of hay will permanently go up a lot. Transporting hay around the country isn't cheap, and it might be, that's something that we need to, can we suck up that cost? Can we afford that cost? And as a track livery owner, it's scary in the way that I can't rely on grass for any real amount or percentage of our horse's diet. It has to be a forage that we know the sugar levels in, because we can't take that risk. We've considered putting some of our own land down as hay so that we have our own supply, but that brings different challenges for us because we're arable farmers as well. It would mean potentially facing a clash between hay season and arable season, and we don't have the manpower to be able to set lots of people different off on lots of different tasks. I think it was last year actually that because of the rain, although the grass was growing, there was never a period of time long enough for them to be able to cut the hay and to bale the hay. I remember saying to my husband that I'm actually really glad we didn't decide to grow hay this year, because what would we be doing? Like, we can't not harvest the crop because we need to do the hay. And obviously, being able to finance getting all of the equipment for it, but also then just taking on the stress yourself of having the time and the money to produce your own hay. It sounds like a lovely idea, but actually it's quite challenging in itself. And it's something that we've decided for the last few years that we're not going to do. But again, it's something that we will have to have a conversation about this year. Is it something that we look into again?
Yeah, and you're totally reliant on the weather working with you, aren't you? And if we had less extreme seasons, it may be the case that actually we wouldn't be in this situation. Would be in, you could, grow your own hay and there wouldn't be a shortage nationwide. And it's so interesting what you say, because actually I've been thinking it without realising and without verbalising it about horse ownership becoming more difficult. And like you say, that's not even mentioning the financial rise, a huge increase in costs right across the board in looking after our horses. But even thinking about the workload, through a lifetime, as many of us are lifetime horse keepers, I remember many years ago being able to have horses out on grass that were susceptible to laminitis, but the grass was not so full of the sugars as it is now. It was much more manageable, whereas now we're seeing these extreme weather conditions and we're seeing things like spring-like grass coming through all times through the year. Grass that's really, really short and sugary. And actually, we've got laminitics that now can no longer go on grass at all, not even in kind of monitored way. So again, they're more in need of us. They're more intensive to look after. And with the extreme weathers, everything becomes more difficult, doesn't it? And more hard work, hard labour and hard graft caring for our beloved animals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really feel for people because, horses generally, and hopefully, God willing, have fairly long lives. So if people have taken on a commitment, 10 years ago, and they're looking at another, possibly even 20 years of commitment to that animal, now obviously people having to face the reality of, do I have to sell my horse? Which for a lot of people is unavoidable, essentially. But you're also looking at selling your horse into a market that is flooded with people having to make similar decisions. And I've known a few people, within my friendship groups that have actually made the decision to have their horses put to sleep rather than risk them going onto a life of completely unknown circumstances. Once you've sold that horse, you've got no control over what happens to it in the future. And these are animals that people have taken on intending to have a lifetime commitment to them, and then finding themselves in a position where they can't fulfill that commitment, and it's just incredibly hard. And again, I'm in a really lucky position that we've got our farmlands, so I've always got somewhere for my horses, but I'm, painfully aware that other people don't have that, that facility themselves, and they've got to find somewhere or someone to be able to take on their horse if they can't afford it. It's either that or, again, they're looking for the cheapest livery possible, or other areas of their life are, being sacrificed to put all of their money in towards their horses.
Absolutely. And, you summarised that so well, Lauren, and really sensitively as well, because as you say, no one could have foreseen this cost of living crisis that we're in at the moment, let alone off the back of the pandemic as well. So it's been an incredible sort of 5 years, hasn't it? Incredibly difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Dare I ask, Lauren, what you think horse ownership's going to look like in the next 5 years? I know that's a really difficult question to ask and very unrealistic for any of us to try and answer, but can you even begin to imagine what that might look like? Do you ever worry about a 5-year plan business-wise in terms of horses?
Yeah, I mean, from my own perspective, business-wise, I always like to have kind of a generic 10-year plan in place and a much more specific 5-year plan. And, we do that in all aspects of the farm as well. It's not just to do with the livery side of things. I genuinely think we are getting to a point where horse ownership is becoming elitist again, and not in a bad way. It's not people with lots of money saying, oh, you people don't deserve horses. It's purely there's a massive percentage of people that just cannot afford it anymore, and people that could afford it previously. And I really think the only people who are able to do horsekeeping on a budget now are those that are lucky enough to find those random 2-acre paddocks that belong to a farmer, or someone's just been renting it out for horses for years, and they perhaps don't realise the money they could be making from that field. I mean, just as an example, so obviously I'm in the southeast, and we have a paddock across the road from us that we're not renting out currently because it needs attention, so it needs new fencing, and it needs to have a good old weed kill session, essentially. We've had people offering us £500 a month for an acre of land, which is, insane. It's absolutely insane. But people are that desperate to, find somewhere to put their horses on, because they can't afford to keep, maybe 4 horses at a livery yard, but to be able to put them in a field together is slightly more manageable. But yeah, I think we're looking at a real sort of divergence and split in the way people are going to keep their horses. And I think it's unavoidable, to be honest. And I know from the livery yard owner perspective, there's a big push and a big drive towards livery yards being licensed, which again is going to cut out those loopholes for people that want something cheaper and perhaps have access to something cheaper. Because obviously, if it's a farmer being told that you've got to be licensed now to have horses on your property to run any kind of livery, they're just going to say, I'm not going to do it. No, thanks, I'm out. And those little pockets of land that people are managing to kind of keep hold of are going to be lost.
Oh, I mean, a terrifying and frightening thought. And thank you for sort of going there, Lauren, because I know it's all something we really don't want to think about, particularly like you mentioned, for those of us who are renting, odd bits of acreage here and there. Something that I try not to think about. But when we have these discussions, I think it's unavoidable. You then your mind starts to wander, doesn't it? If it's difficult now, what's it going to be like in the future? And we need to be ready as horse owners, don't we? If we're going to try and combat the challenges to be able to keep our equines. But thank you so much for delving into some really difficult topics, but also for sharing your story and how you guys are affected in the current hay shortage crisis. Lauren, just mention your Facebook page for those who haven't seen it, and for those who might want to go and check out your tips and tricks and see all your lovely videos of acorn collecting and foraging as well for the horses.
So we are mainly based on Facebook. So we are called Graveney Equine. And we also have a Facebook group, a really lovely active Facebook group called Horse Track Systems. So you generally find me in one of those two places. I do occasionally venture onto other platforms, but I do tend to concentrate on Facebook.
Brilliant.